I'm going to go to Mike White's question. Mike, you said we have a number of resilience forums throughout the UK and globally. Where are the resilience deserts where resilience planning isn't present or mature, and how much a threat it is to the wider resilience program? Of course, we tend to think about urban resilience as being New York or London or Jakarta to a certain extent, Geneva, Dubai. We don't think about it as Dakar or Cairo or Lagos or Rio de Janeiro, the country, those places where there is often a very lack of what we consider centralized governance or government. Um, Kathy, I'm going to bring you in and ask you what your thoughts are on the conversation so far, because you're involved in that in a major city in in Manchester. I'm going to bring Andrew Blade. Ask you, Andrew, to come in from Australia. Athanasios, I'm going to ask you to come in from Athens if you'd like to come in and share your thoughts. If anybody else would like to come in and share their thoughts, certainly if you're in a non-northern city, if you feel that you have another perspective or experience to bring to the game, please do share that with us. But Kathy, let's bring you in now, then Andy, and then Athanasius, and then we'll see if we can bring other people in and then come back to our panelists. Uh, Kathy, over to you.
Thank you. And I just wanted to thank the panelists for their input so far, because I think it's really thought-provoking, and actually the breadth of issues that when you talk about infrastructure and resilience, the breadth of issues that come up is really interesting. There were a couple of reflections that I had. One was we joined, it was then called 100 Resilient Cities, but we joined that back in 2017. And it identified 7 qualities of resilient systems. Now, I can't do these off the top of my head, so I'm going to have to look at my crib sheet. But it basically said that resilient city systems, so our infrastructure, should be reflective, so learning from past events. And I think Mike talking about how in a dense urban environment, you can end up isolating communities through loss of the transport systems is really, I'm going to take that one away, because we're growing, we're getting bigger, the city centre's getting much more dense. So I'm not sure I thought through fully what happens if they become isolated and cut off, because you just don't, it's so connected, the city, you don't think of that happening. But as well as reflective, it's resourceful, it's robust, it's having redundancy, being flexible, inclusive, which is very much something Andy picked up on, and integrated. So I've just been sort of thinking about those qualities whilst our panelists have been talking. And the other thing that I'm finding fascinating is the spatial dimension. So at a city level, Greater Manchester is looking to, it's got 6 growth locations. We're looking to increase by roughly 10%. So in effect, build the city of Manchester all over again. And yet the complexities of getting the infrastructure right in that scenario are quite difficult, despite the sort of thinking that Andy's highlighted, that the UK has been through and that Emma's been talking about. Getting that right is really difficult. But the other thing that comes out is the cross-border nature of that. So we work across the north of England. There's a whole series of big industrial cities across the north of England. And so lots of this is cross-boundary, which brings up Mike's point about there's a bigger picture. And yet it's easy to say, well, we don't want that bit here. Can't you go and put it somewhere else? Or equally wanting to really realise the opportunities of that. And then all of that for us is within this national context. And sometimes we lose sight of the fact that our infrastructure doesn't stop, even though we're an island, doesn't stop at the national borders. We're quite connected up to other countries. So really fascinating conversation so far, David, and really value what the panellists have been saying. Thank you.
It's interesting because you use the word integrative. And of course, we haven't spoken about the socio-economic aspect of that as well. When we talk about resilient cities, one of the things that we say is it's very much like getting fit. If you want your city to be resilient, it's like getting fit personally. And it's a lot easier to get fit if you are fundamentally healthy. If you're fundamentally unhealthy, it's very difficult to get fit. And the truth is that many of our societies are fundamentally unhealthy. There is a and potentially growing polarity between the have and the have-nots. We see criminalization of certain sectors of society based a lot of time on poverty or ethnicity. Though the politicians wouldn't say that, but that is the truth of the matter. We're seeing significant parts of our communities being disempowered and disengaged. We've seen that through the social activity, social unrest across many of our cities in Europe and America over the last few years. And so these are important things. There's a word which I don't think we've used yet, and certainly, Kathy, you didn't use it in your list of what creates resilience. And one is you have to be learning. You have to be fast learning as an organization. You have to be fast learning. And it seems to me that we're not learning. We're just looping around the same problems. Right, I said I was going to bring other people in. Andrew Blaze, let's bring you in from Australia. Athanasios will bring you in from Greece after that. If anybody else would like to come in, Mike White, if you pose that question, if you want to come in, Mike, and make some comments, just put your hand up and we'll bring you in, Mike. And then we'll come back to our panelists. But to you, Andrew, over in Australia, let's bring you in.
Hi, David. Thanks for the invite to come in. Oh, look, Australia's a very big country. Look at Perth, which is one of our smaller cities population-wise. So it's got a population of just under 2 million, but it has an area of 6,500 square kilometres, which is about 2,500 square miles. So we've got very large cities physically, but very small population density, and they're a long way from each other. So even Sydney to Melbourne, which is relatively close, is around about 800 kilometres. So when one of our cities actually has a problem, it's often very hard to get to support to it from other cities. So when we saw the fires of 2019, 2020, which affected most of the East Coast, all of our fundamental mutual support systems didn't function the way we expected them to, just because of the swathe of land that it affected. You couldn't just reach out. And if you want to reach out to Perth that wasn't as badly affected, that's a 3,000K trip. So it's about 36 hours to drive. And we no longer have a national shipping line. We used to. So we used to be able to load things onto ships and move them, but that's still a slow process. So actually being able to have mutual support between those cities becomes quite important. And we've seen that because of those very long supply chains that were mentioned before. Most of the water that is purified in the eastern states relies on chemicals from Western Australia. So when we have a flood that takes out the Nullarbor Highway and the rail in that, we lose the ability to perform basic functions. Now, we were able to solve that last time, but just because of the size of what we've got and the relatively small population, being able to support each other is becoming increasingly difficult. We're seeing we focus a lot on fire in Victoria because we're one of those places that just burns really well. It's very hilly. We've got a lot of oil in the plants that are there. It just burns nicely. But floods are a far bigger problem for us. Floods are really starting to hit us. They're hitting us hard. They do a lot of damage. They do a lot of long-term damage, and the insurers are getting very twitchy about flooding, and they're removing flood insurance. So you can get it, but you've got to be able to spend $20,000, $30,000 a year, which is unaffordable for most people. And even in the commercial space, it's often unaffordable for people. And then on top of that, we're starting to see issues with heat. Sort of the biggest fires we've had in the last 2 decades killed 184 people. Over 360 died in the week leading up to those fires from the heat. So our infrastructure isn't designed to tolerate those types of things. It's not very supportive of, and I know people see Australia as a really hot place. Melbourne itself is not that hot, although it's getting a lot warmer. So our infrastructure is quite out of date. It hasn't been prepared for those things. If you talk to the people who run our train lines, we stress the steel for about 20 degrees. So extreme heat and extreme hot, cold, and we're starting to see more of each are really starting to stress our systems. They're still coping, but the question is for how much longer? And you've heard me say before, I don't worry about climate change much. The climate has changed. It's going to change again. So when we talk about this, it has changed in the last 20 years. Yeah, that's true. It has, but it's still changing. And it's that ongoing change that I just don't think we've got our learning loops small enough and tight enough to be able to learn what we need to do. What we are seeing here in a number of communities is communities are starting to plan for themselves, and they're not including government in those discussions, which government is finding quite difficult to deal with because it's moving into communities during a disaster, and those traditional emergency services are discovering they've already got, call them zero responders, doing things that they weren't expecting them to do. Sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes it causes problems, and sometimes there's safety issues linked with it.
Okay. Andrew, thanks. It's interesting we talk about heat, and I was actually in Australia in October 2019, and for the first time in 17 years, I had asthma attacks because of the smoke. And then I went to Delhi, and I spent a week in Delhi, and I'm carrying an inhaler around with me, which I hadn't done for 20 years, because my lungs got screwed up by those two events. So you had the fire events on one side and the pollution on the other. But it's interesting to talk about heat. We had a 40-degree heat in the UK, which we should not be having. I mean, we should not be having that. I was speaking to somebody in the EU in Europe and saying about what is the European policy planning to manage Europe at 40 degrees. And he said, we don't have one. And of course, as you say, the infrastructure is not designed to run at 40 degrees. Let's bring in Athanasius, because you're in Greece. And of course, Greece has had this massive heat waves, fires, over the last year or so and the last couple of years. Would you like to come in and just tell us a bit about that, maybe, and sort of how some of the impacts of that, and because you're doing your doctorate research around that. Anything you'd like to share with us?
Yes, actually,
Mike, I will bring you in after that, Mike, and we'll go around again. Athanasius, welcome.
I don't think I have to add from the policy perspective from the government or from cities, because my research has to do with critical infrastructure protection, but from the research perspective. So at the moment, I don't have anything more to add. Just happy to share our discussion and be a part of it.
Do you feel, Athanasius, I'm not letting you off that easily.
No problem.
Do you feel that the right questions are being asked by the right people in the right way? I mean, these are serious questions. Whether we ask them or not, these things are going to happen. So do you feel at least there is the awareness, the necessary awareness to deal with these problems or issues?
No. From my perspective, we have to raise awareness about the critical infrastructure protection. And we all know that resilience is a key, especially now with cyber attacks also and cyber physical attacks. So we need to do more research and connect the research with the policy decision makers. That's for sure. From my perspective.
That's what the ISRM, the mission statement of the ISRM when we set it up, and Mike White was involved in that conversation 5 years ago. But when we had that conversation, it was designed to create a space where the academics, the policymakers, and the practitioners could have a grown-up conversation. That was almost our first opening statement. So that's what we're exactly trying to do here. I'm going to bring in Dinesh, but I'll ask you to be brief, Dinesh. But you're up in Nepal. Nepal has had incredible challenging events recently. Of course, it is landlocked. It has incredible infrastructure challenges. Your thoughts on what you've heard so far and any lessons for us, please?
Yeah, thank you, David. And hello, greetings to all. As the Nepal is a landlocked country, the line between the two giant economies, emerging economies like the China and the India, though the Nepal is also dependent on the resource importance from the imported from the other countries, from the India. Most of the construction related materials or the raw materials or food security like things that had been most of the, if we talk on the ratio of import and export, the majority on the import sector. So that if we see for this making the city resilient, or we are talking about the sustainable development goals, making a city and a community resilient, to make infrastructure resilient. For that, if we look into the total life cycle assessment of any project, like a hydropower or the infrastructure like the transportation sector, or the critical infrastructure like data center, if we take Nepal is dependent on the storage of data for the intercommunication system, like it dependent on the Indian side, so that it is very difficult to get rid of these things for making a city resilient. For in the event of disaster like earthquake, if it's earthquake, the communication for the cities from one city to another city will be disrupted due to the landslides, due to the flash floods events that has recently induced in Nepal, as well as also the bursting of the lakes, recently the Solukhumbu has seen that the recent flash flood has been impacted to low-lying areas. So there are numerous challenges and numerous events that have been occurring, and also the induced challenges like the air pollution control, air pollution things in the cities like the Kathmandu, that is heavily populated with the transitional phase from the fossil fuel of transportation to the electrical vehicles. Though government is planning or associated with the global agenda for transitional, that requires a huge amount of finance initiatives. Though the World Bank ADB has committed to make lending for the government, though there are the numerous challenges for the technical expertise to make the resilient infrastructure for the like digital. If we are talking about the digital twins for the security purpose, or for the surveying side, or the making the records of the infrastructure like health monitoring things, like having those are the challenges as well as associated with dependent on the other countries. So those are the effects. Yeah.
That's a fascinating overview, and of course that is where the reality for many people is. That has a reality on their lives of the dependencies of a small player surrounded by these global giants, and we talk about politics. That is very much about politics as well.